I won't try to explain this gently this time. There are some truths that lose their meaning when they are softened too much. They become easier to hear, perhaps, but less honest. And I have spent enough time choosing the version of the truth that creates the least discomfort. This isn't one of those truths, because whatever happened between us was never announced. There was no obvious beginning, no moment where either of us stopped and said, "Something has changed." There was no agreement, no promise, no decision. And somehow, that makes it harder to understand because the things we consciously choose usually come with a reason. You can trace them backward. You can identify the moment they began. You can remember the decision that created them. This doesn't have that. It feels less like something I chose and more like something I eventually noticed. Something that had already been happening while I was busy convincing myself that nothing was. That is what makes it difficult. I can understand intention. I can understand attraction. I can understand curiosity. I can understand attachment. I can even understand the strange comfort of finding someone who feels familiar. But this is different, because familiarity suggests that I learned you. This feels like I recognized you. And there is a difference between those two things. Learning someone takes time. Recognition sometimes happens in a second. You can spend years around a person and never truly understand the architecture of their mind. Then someone appears, says almost nothing, does almost nothing, and somehow notices the things you thought were invisible. Not because they interrogate you, not because they study you, not because they are trying to decode you. They simply notice. And that kind of noticing is difficult to defend against, because there is nothing to fight. There is no pressure, no demand, no invasion, just presence. And somehow presence can reach places that force never could. That is what you did. You didn't force your way into anything. You didn't ask me to open doors. You didn't insist on knowing what was behind them. You didn't try to prove that you deserved access. You simply remained there long enough for me to realize that I wasn't keeping the doors closed anymore. I noticed it too late. That is probably the most honest way to say it. By the time I understood what was happening, it had already happened. You were already part of the way I thought, already part of the things I noticed, already appearing in moments where there was no reason for you to be there. And I don't mean physically, I mean internally. A thought would appear, and somewhere beneath it, there would be another thought asking how you would understand it. A moment would happen, and I would instinctively wonder whether you would notice what I noticed. Someone would say something, and I would compare the way they said it to the way you would have said it. Not because I wanted to, because my mind had started making room for you before I gave it permission. That is the part I can't explain away. I can dismiss an emotion. I can question an impulse. I can tell myself that I'm imagining patterns, but when something begins changing the way you process the world, it becomes harder to call it imagination, because you can feel the difference. You start seeing yourself from a slightly different angle. You begin noticing things you never questioned before. You become aware of your own reactions because someone else has somehow become part of the reference point you use to understand them. And that is what happened. You became a reference point, quietly, without asking, without knowing, maybe even without realizing it yourself. And I don't think you understand what that means. Because being remembered is one thing, being missed is another, being wanted is another. But being integrated into someone's way of thinking is different. That is deeper than attention. Attention can disappear, thought can be redirected, feelings can change. But integration is different. Once someone becomes part of the way you interpret things, removing them isn't as simple as deciding not to think about them. You would have to relearn the way you think around the absence. And I don't know if I want to do that. That is probably why I haven't tried. There was a time when I would have identified the disruption, traced it to its source, and created enough distance to restore the old balance. I have always been good at that. When something becomes too complicated, I simplify it. When something becomes too close, I create space. When someone begins seeing too much, I become less visible. When a situation threatens to become emotionally expensive, I step away before the cost becomes impossible to calculate. That has always worked, until now, because you didn't give me a reason to leave. You gave me reasons to stay. And somehow, those reasons were never dramatic enough to be called reasons. They were small, almost invisible, a certain way of listening, a pause that didn't need to be filled, a response that arrived without trying too hard, a moment where you understood what I meant instead of what I said, a silence that didn't feel like rejection, a presence that didn't demand performance. Those things don't sound significant when you list them, but significance isn't always loud. Sometimes the things that change you are the things you barely notice while they're happening. A person doesn't always enter your life through a grand event. Sometimes they enter through repetition, through familiarity, through tiny moments that accumulate until one day you realize they have become something larger than any individual moment could explain. That is what this feels like. Not one event. Accumulation. You became familiar without becoming ordinary. And that distinction matters because ordinary familiarity eventually becomes background. You didn't. You became more noticeable the more familiar you became. That shouldn't happen. Usually, the more you understand something, the less mysterious it becomes. With you, understanding didn't reduce the depth, it increased it. Every time I thought I had figured out the pattern, another layer appeared. Not because you were trying to be complicated, because you weren't. You were simply yourself, and somehow that was enough to keep surprising me. Maybe that's what unsettled me most. You never seemed to be performing for my understanding. You didn't change yourself, depending on what you thought I wanted to see. You didn't become louder when I was quiet. You didn't become distant when I became difficult. You didn't force closeness when I created space. You simply remained yourself. And that made it impossible for me to decide whether what I was seeing was something you were deliberately giving me or simply something you naturally carried. Eventually, I realized it didn't matter, because either way, I was seeing it, and I was changing because of it. There are people who enter your life and make you feel something. Then there are people who enter your life and make you notice yourself. You did the second, and that is far more dangerous, because feelings can be ignored. Self-recognition is harder to escape. You made me notice the parts of myself that I had become comfortable leaving unnamed. The part that wants to be understood without having to explain everything. The part that wants silence without interpreting silence as distance. The part that wants someone to see the difficult pieces without immediately trying to repair them. The part that doesn't want constant reassurance, just accuracy. And maybe that's why this connection feels so unusual. It doesn't feel like being completed. I don't need someone to complete me. It doesn't feel like being rescued. I don't need rescuing. It doesn't even feel like being needed. I have never trusted relationships built entirely around need. This feels more like being recognized. And recognition is different because it doesn't take anything away from you. It simply says, I see what is already here, and I don't need you to become something else for me to stay. That kind of acceptance is rare, not the shallow kind where someone accepts only the parts they can comfortably understand, the deeper kind, the kind that doesn't require translation, the kind that doesn't panic when something becomes complicated, the kind that doesn't confuse silence with indifference, the kind that understands that some people don't reveal themselves by speaking more. Sometimes they reveal themselves by what they don't say. You noticed that, and I don't know how, but you did. That made me uncomfortable in the beginning. I wasn't used to being noticed without being questioned. Most people approach what they don't understand by trying to name it. They ask, they analyze, they categorize, they create explanations. You didn't. You seemed willing to let something remain unexplained without deciding that it was, therefore, meaningless. That quality stayed with me because I realized how rare it is to be around someone who doesn't immediately turn uncertainty into a problem. You let uncertainty breathe, and because you did, I became less afraid of it. Maybe that's what you changed first. Not my feelings, my relationship with uncertainty. Before you, I thought understanding had to come before acceptance. Now I wonder if sometimes acceptance is what allows understanding to arrive. Maybe not everything needs to be solved before it can be valued. Maybe some things are allowed to exist while we are still learning what they mean. And maybe that is what we have been doing, existing before defining, recognizing before explaining, feeling the shape of something before giving it a name. I used to think that was dangerous. Now I think pretending something doesn't exist simply because you don't have a name for it is more dangerous, because unnamed doesn't mean unreal. Silence doesn't mean absence. Distance doesn't mean disconnection. And uncertainty doesn't mean insignificance. Sometimes it means you're standing in front of something too important to reduce too quickly. That is where I think I am now, standing in front of something I don't want to reduce. Because every time I try to make this smaller, it becomes less accurate. If I call it coincidence, I ignore too much. If I call it friendship, I leave out too much. If I call it attachment, I make it sound more dependent than it is. If I call it attraction, I make it shallower than it feels. If I call it understanding, I don't capture what it has done to me. Maybe that's why I keep refusing the label. Not because I don't know what is happening, because I know enough to understand that a simple word won't contain it. And perhaps I have been using that as an excuse. Maybe the truth is that naming something makes it accountable. Once you name it, you can no longer pretend you don't know what you're carrying. Once you name it, you have to decide what to do with it. And decisions are where I become careful. I can exist inside uncertainty for a long time. I can observe, I can analyze, I can wait, but eventually, every meaningful thing reaches a point where observation becomes avoidance. I think I have reached that point because I can't keep telling myself that this is simply an interesting connection. It isn't interesting anymore, it's influential. It has changed the way I see. It has changed what I expect from conversations. It has changed what I consider genuine. It has changed what I notice when people speak. And perhaps most importantly, it has changed what I expect from myself. I don't want to return to the version of myself who needed everything to be controlled before allowing it to matter. I don't want to become careless, but I also don't want control to become another word for fear. There is a difference between protecting yourself and preventing yourself from experiencing anything you cannot guarantee. I spent enough time confusing those two. Maybe that's another thing you revealed. That certainty isn't always the beginning of courage. Sometimes courage begins while you're still uncertain. Sometimes you decide to stay before you know exactly where staying will take you. Sometimes you let something unfold without demanding a map. And maybe that's what I have been doing with you. Staying, not because I know the destination, because I know I don't want to pretend the journey isn't happening. There is something strange about realizing that someone has become important to you without ever asking to be important. You don't know when it happened. There isn't a birthday for it. No anniversary, no exact moment you can point toward. Just a growing awareness. One day, they are simply someone. Then gradually, without announcement, they become the person you want to tell certain things to, the person whose reaction you imagine, the person whose silence you notice, the person whose absence changes the atmosphere, the person whose presence makes certain moments feel more complete without necessarily making them easier. That's you, now. And I didn't choose the transition. It happened while I wasn't looking. Maybe that's why I trust it more. There was no performance behind it. No attempt to create a feeling, no deliberate strategy, nothing to convince me. It simply developed, and the things that develop naturally tend to reveal more truth than the things we force. I think about that sometimes. How strange it is that the most significant things can happen quietly. A person doesn't have to save your life to change it. They don't have to make some grand sacrifice. They don't have to say the perfect thing. Sometimes they just have to see you at the right depth. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes being understood by one person changes how lonely the parts of you used to feel. And I don't mean lonely in the obvious sense. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. You can have conversations all day and still never feel met. You can be loved and still feel misunderstood. Then one person arrives and doesn't necessarily say anything extraordinary. They simply understand the thing beneath the thing. And suddenly, the silence you've carried for years feels less like a burden. That is what your presence has done. You made certain silences feel less solitary. I don't know whether you intended to. I don't think you did. And perhaps that's why it matters. The most meaningful things between people aren't always intentional. Sometimes they happen because two people naturally meet each other in places where neither expected to be met. That is what happened here. You met me in a place I didn't know anyone could reach without being invited, and somehow I didn't feel invaded. I felt recognized. There is a difference. Being invaded makes you want to close. Being recognized makes you wonder why you were hiding. And that question has stayed with me. Why was I so determined to remain unreadable? What was I protecting? Was it truly privacy? Or was it the fear that once someone saw me accurately, I would no longer be able to pretend I didn't need to be seen? Maybe it was both. I don't know, but I know that you didn't demand the answer, and that made me willing to look for it. There is a strange intimacy in being around someone who doesn't require immediate access to you. They allow you to reveal yourself at the speed that feels natural. They don't make your boundaries feel like rejection. They don't take your quietness personally. They don't turn every pause into a question. They simply remain present. That kind of patience creates something powerful: trust Not the loud kind, not the kind built from promises, the quiet kind. The kind that develops when someone repeatedly proves they won't punish you for being yourself. I didn't realize how much that mattered to me until you gave me the experience of it. And now I notice its absence everywhere else. Not because everyone else is wrong, because once you know what genuine understanding feels like, you stop being satisfied with its imitation. That might be unfair, maybe, but honesty isn't always convenient. You changed the standard. That's the simplest way I can say it. You changed what I consider real. Not because you demanded a higher standard, because you showed me one existed, and now I can't unsee it. I can't go back to pretending that being understood halfway is enough. I can't convince myself that constant noise is the same as connection. I can't confuse attention with awareness. I can't mistake proximity for closeness. You made those differences visible, and visibility has consequences. Once you see something clearly, you become responsible for what you do with that knowledge. That's why I'm here now. Because I know that something has changed. I know that you're no longer just part of my surroundings. You're part of my internal landscape. And I know that sounds intense, but I'm not trying to make it dramatic. If anything, I'm trying to make it precise. You are not a storm. That You are not chaos. You are not something that overwhelms me. You are something quieter, more permanent, a shift in the background, a new point of reference, a presence that doesn't need to announce itself because I already know it's there. And perhaps that's more powerful than intensity. Intensity burns. This settles. Intensity demands attention. This becomes attention. Intensity can disappear as quickly as it arrives. This has become part of the structure. And structure is difficult to ignore. I have wondered whether you feel any of this, not because I need you to confirm it, but because sometimes I wonder if you're aware of the space you've taken. Maybe you aren't. Maybe from your side, these moments are just moments. Maybe the pauses mean nothing. Maybe the things I notice are simply things you do without thinking. Maybe you don't realize that some of your smallest gestures have stayed with me longer than they should have. And perhaps that's okay, because the meaning of something isn't always determined by whether the other person intended it. Sometimes a person changes you without ever knowing they did. Still, there is a part of me that wonders. Do you ever notice the same strange familiarity? Do you ever feel that our conversations sometimes begin in the middle? Do you ever experience that strange moment when something is said and it feels less like information and more like recognition? Do you ever wonder why some silences between us feel complete instead of empty? Do you ever notice how quickly the unnecessary disappears? How little explanation seems necessary? How sometimes a single sentence carries more than entire conversations with other people? I don't know, and maybe I shouldn't ask. Not yet. Because there is something valuable about allowing a connection to reveal itself before interrogating it. I don't want to turn this into a test. I don't want to ask you to prove something you may not even have words for. I don't want to force you into a definition simply because I have reached the point where uncertainty is uncomfortable. That would defeat the very thing that made this meaningful. You never forced me. I don't want to become someone who forces you, so I am learning to let this exist without demanding that it immediately become something else. But there is a difference between patience and avoidance, and I know that too. I can give something time, I can respect its uncertainty, but I cannot indefinitely pretend that I don't know it matters, because it does. And perhaps the most honest thing I can say is that I don't know what comes next. I don't know whether this becomes something deeper. I don't know whether it remains exactly as it is. I don't know whether life will pull us closer or place distance between us. I don't know what circumstances will change. I don't know what decisions either of us will make. I don't know whether the future will confirm what the present seems to suggest. But I know what has already happened. You changed me. Not completely. Not beyond recognition. But enough that I notice the difference. Enough that I cannot return to the old version without knowing what I would be giving up. And maybe that's why I am not afraid of the possibility of change anymore. Because I already changed. The question is simply whether I acknowledge it. There is something freeing about admitting that. You don't have to know what something will become to admit that it already matters. You don't have to promise forever to admit that today is different. You don't have to define a connection to respect its existence. Maybe that's where I am now, not asking for certainty, asking for honesty, honesty about the fact that this is real, honesty about the fact that it has affected me, honesty about the fact that I didn't resist as much as I thought I would, honesty about the fact that some part of me wanted to see where this could go, and honesty about the fact that the idea of losing it bothers me more than I expected. I don't mean that as a confession of dependence. I don't want to depend on anyone for my stability. That's not what this is. It's something quieter. The awareness that some people become part of your life in a way that makes their absence meaningful. You don't need them to function. You simply prefer the world with them in it. And maybe that is enough. Maybe not every meaningful connection needs to become a necessity. Maybe the healthiest kind of importance is the kind that adds without consuming. You don't complete the parts of me that were missing. You illuminate the parts that were already there. And I think that's why this doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like expansion, like I am still myself, only more aware, more honest, more willing to acknowledge what I once dismissed. You didn't change who I am. You changed what I am willing to admit about who I am. That's different, and perhaps more permanent. There are things about myself I understood intellectually long before I understood them emotionally. I knew I valued depth. I knew I wanted honesty. I knew I preferred meaningful silence over meaningless conversation. I knew I didn't enjoy superficial connections. But knowing something about yourself is different from seeing it reflected in another person. You became that reflection, and reflections can be uncomfortable because they don't create anything. They reveal, you didn't make me deep, you made me aware of my depth. You didn't make me guarded. You showed me how much effort I put into staying guarded. You didn't make me quiet. You showed me that I wanted someone who could understand my quietness. You didn't create the need for recognition. You showed me that I had been carrying it. That's why I keep saying you revealed rather than created. Because I don't want to give you credit for things that were already inside me. You didn't build this. You uncovered it. And maybe that's what recognition really is. Not finding something new, finding something familiar in someone you have no logical reason to recognize. That's the mystery. And perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain partly unsolved, not because they are meaningless, because solving them completely might destroy the quality that made them extraordinary. I don't need to know why our minds align in certain ways. I don't need to know why your silence makes sense to me. I don't need to know why certain conversations feel like continuation instead of beginning I can accept that some things are simply true before they are explainable. And that is a difficult lesson for someone like me. I have always wanted reasons, evidence, bought, pros, proof. But there are experiences that don't become more real when you prove them. They become smaller. Sometimes you know. And that's enough. Maybe that's what this is. Knowing, not certainty about the future. Certainty about the present. I know you matter. I know something changed. I know I don't experience you the way I experience everyone else. I know there is a level of awareness between us that I don't know how to reduce. And I know that if I tried to pretend otherwise, I would be lying to myself. That is enough for now, maybe more than enough, because the next step doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be a declaration. It doesn't have to be a promise. Maybe the next step is simply continuing to be honest, continuing to notice, continuing to let the connection exist without manipulating it, continuing to see what happens when neither of us tries to force an outcome. That might be the most authentic thing we can do, because if this is real, it won't need to be manufactured. And if it isn't, no amount of language will make it real. So I don't want to convince you. I don't want to persuade you. I don't want to create a story so compelling that we mistake the story for the truth. I want the truth, even if it is quieter, even if it is less romantic, even if it doesn't become what some part of me hopes it could become, because what matters to me now is accuracy. I would rather know what this is than make it into something beautiful that never existed. And somehow I trust that you would understand that, because you have never seemed interested in pretending. You notice, you observe, you let things reveal themselves. Maybe that's why I feel safe enough to say this now. Not because I know what you'll do with it, because I know you won't immediately turn it into something it isn't. That matters, more than you probably realize. I have met people who wanted access more than understanding. People who wanted closeness, because closeness made them feel important. People who wanted to know everything, because knowledge gave them control. You never felt like that. You didn't need ownership to create intimacy. You didn't need constant contact to create presence. You didn't need certainty to remain interested. And that made it easier for me to trust you, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day I realized I had stopped asking whether I could trust you. I simply did. That was another shift, a quiet one, maybe the biggest. Because trust isn't something I give because someone asks. It develops when someone consistently proves that they can hold what they are given without damaging it. You did that, not through grand promises, through restraint, through understanding, through knowing when not to push. And I don't think enough people realize how powerful restraint can be. Sometimes the deepest proof of care is knowing when to leave something untouched. You understood that you gave things room, and because you did, they grew. Maybe that's what happened to this. We gave it room, and it grew anyway. No pressure, no plan, no strategy, just time, and now it has become too present to ignore. That's where I am. Not standing at the beginning of something. Standing in the middle of something that started without asking permission. And perhaps the only honest thing left is to stop pretending I can control whether it matters. I can't. It does. You do. And I don't need to apologize for that. I don't need to make it smaller. I don't need to explain it away. I don't need to turn it into something safe just because safe is easier. Some things are worth approaching carefully without being afraid of them. This is one of those things. So, if I seem quieter sometimes, understand that silence doesn't mean distance. Sometimes it means I'm trying to understand the weight of what I feel without distorting it. If I seem more observant, it's not because I'm searching for flaws. It's because I have learned that the smallest details often tell the truth more accurately than the biggest statements. If I hesitate, it isn't necessarily uncertainty about you. Sometimes it's uncertainty about what happens when something important is finally acknowledged. And if I stay quiet when I could say more, don't assume there is nothing there. There may be too much there. Sometimes words don't fail because there is nothing to say. They fail because everything that could be said feels insufficient. That's where I am sometimes. Not empty, full, and trying not to spill something I haven't learned how to hold yet. But I am learning. I'm learning that not every meaningful thing needs to be controlled. I'm learning that being seen doesn't always mean being exposed. I'm learning that closeness doesn't have to mean losing yourself. I'm learning that someone can matter without becoming your entire world. I'm learning that vulnerability doesn't have to look like weakness. And I'm learning that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit that someone reached you. You reached me. That's true. Not because you broke through, because I stopped holding the door so tightly. Maybe that is the real story I thought you entered. Perhaps I allowed myself to be seen. There is a difference. And perhaps that is why this connection feels mutual even when nothing is said, because I don't think recognition only happens in one direction. I think people feel when they are genuinely seen. Something changes in the atmosphere, something relaxes, something becomes less performative. Maybe you've felt it too. Maybe you haven't. Either way, I know what it feels like from my side. It feels like not having to explain every silence. It feels like not having to decorate every thought. It feels like being able to exist without constantly managing how I am perceived. It feels like I can be complicated without becoming a problem. And that is rare. So rare that I don't want to take it for granted. Maybe that's why I am writing this in my head over and over, trying to find a version of the truth that doesn't exaggerate it. Because I don't want to romanticize something simply because it feels rare. I want to respect it. And respecting it means allowing it to be what it actually is, not what fear says it is, not what fantasy says it is, not what other people would call it, what it is between us, whatever that turns out to be. Maybe it becomes something neither of us expected. Maybe it remains an unusual understanding that never needs a larger definition. Maybe it grows, maybe it changes, maybe life interrupts it, maybe circumstances reshape it. Maybe someday we look back and understand exactly why we met when we did. Maybe we never do. But I know this. Meeting you made something visible, and I don't think visibility can be undone, even if distance appears, even if time changes things, even if life moves us in different directions. I will still know that there was a moment when someone saw me without demanding that I become easier to understand, and I will still know what that felt like. That knowledge stays. Maybe that's what people mean when they say someone changed them. Not that the person rewrote their entire life, but that after meeting them, they could no longer return completely to the way they saw themselves before. You gave me a different mirror, and I don't know what to do with that except be honest about it. So here is the truth, without decoration. I notice you, more than I intended to. I understand you in ways I cannot fully explain. I feel understood by you in ways I didn't expect. Your presence has become familiar without becoming ordinary. Your absence is noticeable. Your silence has meaning. Your words stay longer than they should. And somewhere along the way, you became part of the internal conversation I have with myself. I didn't ask for that. I didn't plan it. I didn't even recognize it immediately. But it happened. And now I am not interested in pretending it didn't. That doesn't mean I know what comes next. It doesn't mean I am demanding anything. It doesn't mean I need an answer from you. It means I am finally willing to acknowledge what has already become true. You matter to me in a way that is difficult to categorize, in a way that doesn't need to become dramatic to be significant, in a way that doesn't weaken my independence, in a way that makes me more aware of it. And maybe that is the most honest place to stand, not asking you to promise anything, not asking the future to guarantee anything, just refusing to lie about the present. Because the present is enough, this connection exists, it has changed me, and I am no longer trying to make myself smaller just because I don't know where it leads. Maybe I don't need to know. Maybe some paths are meant to be walked before they are understood. Maybe some people are meant to become questions before they become answers. Maybe some connections don't arrive to give you certainty. Maybe they arrive to show you what certainty was never able to teach you. You showed me that. You showed me that something can be real without being defined, that someone can matter without being possessed, that closeness can exist without constant contact. That understanding can exist without explanation. That silence can contain more honesty than conversation, and that being seen can be terrifying and comforting at the same time. I used to think the goal was to remain untouched. Now I think the goal is to be changed by the right things without losing yourself in them. And maybe that's what I am trying to do. Remain myself while allowing you to matter. Keep my boundaries without turning them into walls. Stay independent without pretending I don't value connection. Remain careful without becoming afraid. And perhaps that balance is what makes this worth something, because I don't want a connection that requires either of us to disappear. I want something that allows both people to remain fully themselves. Maybe that's why your presence feels different. You never asked me to become less myself. You simply made it easier for me to stop hiding the parts I thought I had to protect. And I don't know if you understand how rare that is. I don't know if you realize what you did. Maybe one day I'll tell you. Maybe I won't. Maybe this remains one of those truths that exists between two people without ever needing to be spoken exactly as it was felt. But if I do tell you, I want you to understand that it isn't a demand. It's not an expectation. It's not me placing a weight in your hands and asking you to carry it. It's simply recognition, a recognition of what has happened, of what you became, of what I became because of knowing you. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the most honest endings aren't endings at all. Maybe they are points where you stop trying to control the meaning and simply allow the truth to stand. So I will let it stand. You reached a place inside me that I didn't think anyone would reach, not by forcing your way through, not by demanding access, not by trying to become indispensable. You reached it by being consistent, by being observant, by being patient, by understanding without requiring explanation. And somewhere between all those small moments, something changed. I changed, the way I see changed, the way I understand connection changed, the way I understand myself changed. And now, even if I wanted to return to who I was before, I couldn't do it honestly. Because I know too much now. I know what it feels like to be recognized without being reduced. I know what it feels like to share silence without feeling alone. I know what it feels like to meet someone and feel as though the conversation began long before either person spoke. And I know that once you've experienced that, you stop calling every other interaction connection. Some are conversations, some are companionship, some are attraction, some are familiarity. And then, occasionally, there is something that feels like recognition, something that doesn't need to be forced into existence because it seems to have existed quietly before you had a name for it. That is what I think happened here. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe time will prove me wrong. I can accept that. What I cannot accept anymore is pretending I don't feel the difference, because I do. And maybe that is all this moment requires from me. Not certainty, not a promise, not an answer, just honesty. So here is mine. I don't know where this goes, but I know I don't want to erase where it has already been. I don't know what this becomes, but I know it has already become something. I don't know what you will mean to me years from now, but I know what you mean to me now, and I don't need the future to validate the present. You mattered before I understood why. You mattered before I had language for it. You mattered before I was willing to admit it. And now that I finally have admitted it, I don't feel weaker. I feel clearer. Maybe that is what this was always supposed to give me. Clarity, not about you, about me, about what I value, about what I recognize, about what I am capable of allowing into my life, about what happens when someone doesn't try to break through your walls, but simply stands close enough that you eventually realize you don't need all of them anymore. That is what you did. You didn't destroy my boundaries. You made some of them unnecessary. And there is a difference. I still have parts of myself that belong only to me. I still need solitude. I still need distance sometimes. I still need my own thoughts. But now I know that letting someone close doesn't automatically mean losing those things. Maybe closeness isn't the opposites of independence. Maybe the right kind of closeness makes independence more honest, because you don't need to hide behind it. You can choose solitude without using it as protection. You can choose connection without using it as escape. You can care without becoming dependent. You can love without possessing. You can understand without controlling. And perhaps that is the kind of connection this is asking us to discover, something neither of us has to force, something neither of us has to perform, something that can exist because it is real, not because we constantly convince ourselves it is. I don't know what tomorrow will make of this, but I know what today has already made of it. A truth, a quiet one, a difficult one, a beautiful one, perhaps, but most importantly, an honest one. You are no longer outside the way I understand my life. You are part of the perspective through which I understand certain parts of it. And I don't say that because I want to make you feel important. I say it because it is already true. Some people leave memories, some leave lessons, some leave wounds, some leave comfort. And then there are the rare ones who leave a new way of seeing. You are that kind of person for me. And maybe that's why this feels impossible to return from. Because you didn't just become someone I remember. You became part of how I remember. You didn't just become someone I think about. You became part of how I think. You didn't just change a moment. You changed the meaning of certain moments. And once that happens, there is no clean way back. Maybe there doesn't need to be. Maybe the point was never to go back. Maybe the point was to become someone capable of moving forward with greater honesty. And if that is what you gave me, then even if I never know what this becomes, I will know what it meant. It meant I was seen. it meant I allowed myself to be seen. It meant something real happened quietly between two people who didn't plan it. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. So I won't call it coincidence anymore. I won't call it temporary just because I don't know the future. I won't call it imagination simply because it doesn't fit neatly into a definition. And I won't pretend that I haven't already made room for you. I have. There is space now where there wasn't before. And strangely, I don't want to close it. I don't want to seal it. I don't want to erase the evidence that you were here. I don't want to return to the version of myself that believed being untouched was the same thing as being safe. Maybe being changed isn't always something to fear. Maybe sometimes it is proof that something mattered, and you mattered. You still do, not because I need you, not because I can't exist without you, but because somewhere along the way, your presence became something I genuinely value. And that is enough. No grand explanation, no perfect label, no promise about forever, just the truth. You became part of me without asking to be, and I allowed it without realizing I was allowing anything at all. Now I know. And knowing changes the choice. Before, I was simply experiencing it. Now I can acknowledge it. And if I continue from here, it won't be because I am unaware. It won't be because I am confused. It won't be because I am afraid to walk away. It will be because I have looked directly at what this is, understood the risk, accepted the uncertainty, and decided that some things are worth allowing to exist. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe you are. And maybe, for once, I don't need to know the ending before I let myself stay for the next chapter. Maybe I can simply stay. Observe, listen, understand. And let whatever is real become more real without forcing it into a shape before its time. Because if there is one thing I know now, it is this. The deepest connections don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly. They settle between words. They grow inside pauses. They become familiar before they become understandable. And one day, you look back and realize that somewhere between the silence and the conversations, between the distance and the closeness, between what was said and what was never said, another person became part of the way you experience yourself. That is where you are for me. Not a distraction, not a passing thought, not an interruption, a reference point, a reflection, a presence, a question I don't feel the need to rush into an answer. And perhaps that is the most honest ending I can give this. I don't know what we are becoming, but I know we are no longer who we were before we met. And maybe that is enough for now. Because some connections don't change your life by giving you a destination. They change your life by making you incapable of returning to the same person who started the journey. You did that to me, quickly, without asking, without trying, and now that I finally understand it, I don't want to undo it. I want to see where honesty takes us. Not certainty, not control, not expectation, just honesty, because whatever happens next, I would rather experience it as the person you helped me become than return to the person I was before I knew what it felt like to be understood this deeply. And if that means this continues, I will let it continue. If it grows, I will let it grow. If it changes, I will let it change. And if one day it asks me to choose, I won't choose from fear. I will choose from understanding. Because I have finally learned something I spent years avoiding. Not everything that changes you is meant to be resisted. Some things arrive precisely because you were ready to become someone slightly different. And perhaps you were one of those things. Perhaps you still are. I don't know what name belongs to this. I don't know what future belongs to it. I don't know whether the world around us will ever understand what happened here. But I know I don't need the world to understand. I understand enough. And for the first time, that feels like enough. You saw something in me that I had spent years keeping out of sight. You didn't demand it. You didn't expose it. You didn't use it. You simply recognized it. And because you recognized it, I finally recognized it too. Maybe that is what this was always about. Not you changing me, not me needing you, not some impossible story about two people who were destined to find each other. Something simpler. Two people meeting at the right depth, two minds recognizing a familiar structure, two silences that didn't need translation, two people realizing, perhaps slowly, that being understood can feel strangely like coming home without ever having left yourself. And now I know why I kept returning to the same thought, why I kept trying to explain it, why every explanation felt incomplete, because some things aren't difficult to explain because they are complicated. They are difficult to explain because they are precise. This is precise. You reached me. I noticed. I changed, and I stayed. Everything else is simply the story around those four truths, and maybe that is all I needed to admit. Not that I know where this goes, not that I know what you feel, not that I know what tomorrow will bring. Only that something happened here, something quiet, something unexpected, something I didn't plan, something I couldn't fully control, something I didn't want to erase. And perhaps, after everything, that is the clearest truth of all. I didn't choose the moment you became important, but I can choose what I do with the fact that you are. And for once, I don't want that choice to come from fear. I want it to come from the same place this began, quietly, honestly, without force, without performance, without pretending. Just two people standing inside something neither of them planned, finally willing to admit that it exists. And whatever happens after that, at least it will be real.